Much do Donald Trump and Narendra Modi really have in common? The question can be asked. India's prime minister to become the first foreign leader to dine at the White House since Trump replaced Barack Obama back in January. Now, their personal lifestyles may be radically different, but both, well, you can argue they're nationalists, strong personalities. They sometimes go after critical press coverage. Both claim to be pro-business and against bureaucracy. No wonder the candidate Trump was so effusive in courting the Indian diaspora. Trump's even appointed his first U.S. ambassador to the United Nations of Indian heritage. But what does that change when it comes to policy and on matters such as Pakistan and Afghanistan? And for all the tough talk on China, is Trump's strategy really going to go the way that India wants? And then, of course, there's the issues of trade. Now, for India, trade means open borders. And open borders mean, well, work and study visas. And while many ask how much Narendra Modi is really opening up his nation's economy as promised, there are those asking how much Donald Trump is closing off his own, especially when it comes to work visas. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the ties that bind Modi and Trump. With us from Washington, Sadanand Dume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, regularly a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
From New Delhi, Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire. Thank you for joining us. Thanks as well to Gaurav Bhatia, spokesperson for the ruling BJP party. And with us in the studio, Joël Ruet, president of the Bridge think tank.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Their first face-to-face meeting preceded by last week's announcement that the Trump administration had approved India's tentative purchase of nearly 24 unarmed surveillance drones. Just how close those two leaders will be in the future, well, that's still undecided. Alan Gainsford has more.
In the shadow of the White House, this welcome committee is eagerly awaiting Narendra Modi. The Indian Prime Minister is set to meet Donald Trump with the aim of reinforcing ties between the two countries.
We wish that Prime Minister Modi take up the issue of terrorism, which is taking roots in South Asia right now, and that's a priority of Mr. Trump as well.
Defense is a topic where the two leaders share similar goals. The US has given the green light to the sale of unarmed surveillance drones to India in a deal worth around $2 billion. But not everyone's happy about the decision. These protesters believe Narendra Modi is undemocratic.
Right now they are promoting Modi and the Indian so-called democracy where there is no religious freedom, no freedom of expression. And 10 years later they will be using the same US army and our citizens and our money to bring Modi down.
The two leaders will have some difficult topics to discuss. The elephant in the room will be Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. The US president accused India of seeking to profit from the deal, negotiating to receive billions of dollars of aid. Another cause of friction, Trump's decision to overhaul H-1B visas as part of his hire American policy. India is the biggest beneficiary of this program, a temporary employment visa for workers in specialist occupations. Silicon Valley's biggest firms, including Facebook and Google, use the program to bring in Indian IT talent. But despite these lurking issues, observers have pointed out the similarities between the two leaders that could help their relationship. Both of them came to power as media-savvy political outsiders.
Yeah, lots in common, but issues that divide. Sadanand Dume, what is the acid test as to whether or not Donald Trump and Narendra Modi will get along in the long run?
I'm not sure if there's any one acid test, but I think what people would be looking for, people who've been following this relationship for quite a while, would be a reaffirmation from the White House, from Donald Trump in particular, that he believes what most of his last three predecessors have believed, which is that the rise of India is good for America. There's been a question mark over that ever since his election, and I think that's the biggest sort of takeaway that people will be looking for.
Yeah, you're saying that Donald Trump should be somebody who goes for continuity when it comes to strengthening U.S.-India ties.
That's certainly the hope, and that's certainly the what I think the Indian side will be looking for as its main takeaway.
But there's been, again, there were mixed messages, and there were mixed messages on the campaign trail from Trump. Have you been able to surmise where he really wants to take this?
Now, on the campaign trail, he made it very clear that he wanted to be a good friend of India. He said he'd be one of, India would not find a better friend. He appealed to the Indian American community. He even had an ad in Hindi, which I believe is a sort of first time for a US presidential candidate, spoke a few words in Hindi himself. Of course, mangled the pronunciation, but you can't hold that against him. So I think he wants to have a good relationship with India. The problem really is that some of his other rhetoric, which has been quite protectionist, which has been quite nativist, does create areas of tension, particularly on issues of trade and immigration.
Are they similar, Gaurav Bhatia, Donald Trump, and Narendra Modi? We heard in that report by Ellen Gainsford about how they're both pitted themselves as outsiders with strong messaging. Are they similar, or are they very different men?
The visit is being viewed with a lot of optimism. And Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is the strongest and the most popular that India has seen after independence. And the US and India are two very vibrant democracies and very strong democracies in the world. And India understands the need to work with the US the same way the US also acknowledges that there is a common ground where we can build relations. These areas are basically commerce, because India is one of the biggest consumer market, and mutually they can be a very beneficial relationship for both the countries. Another area is the defense cooperation. We have seen how India is looking at from the technology that the US has, be it the drones, and there are other defense mechanism that India is looking at.
All right, so wait, but we'll talk about defense in a moment. Let's focus on your first point, commerce there, Gaurav. On the candidate, Donald Trump, when it came to those visas and letting in Indian workers come through, free movement of people, right? He said he wants only the most skilled and highest paid applicants. His person in charge of free trade negotiations has been a little cagey as to what the future of those H-1B visas will be. Is that a red line for you?
It is definitely a very important aspect from Indian point of view, and especially because the software engineers and people who hold H-1 visas have contributed immensely to the US economy as well, and over a period of time. They have not mushroomed in a very short time. So when we hear that the Trump administration will reduce the quota, it is definitely something that would be a priority. And we are sure that a very meaningful, constructive dialogue would take place between Mr. Narendra Modi and Mr. Trump.
Let me ask you, Siddharth Varadarajan, can Trump and Modi find common ground on this?
Well, I think the rhetoric that Donald Trump employed during the campaign and some of the statements that he's made, for example, when he walked away from the Paris climate change deal, suggests that he is not above taking a rather narrow nationalist view on what is an important bilateral relationship for the US and has always been for the last 20 years. That said, I think I get the sense, if you look at the Trumpian policy towards Syria or Russia or China, that the deep state in America, the hardcore establishment interests, are finding a way to assert themselves. And when it comes to India and the US, we've seen a remarkable degree of continuity, stretching across 3 administrations now, if we go back to Clinton. and then George W. Bush and Obama, where there is a broad understanding that a deeper strategic partnership with India is unambiguously in America's interest. So I would imagine that at the end of the day, whatever tactical maneuvering Mr. Trump has to do to protect particular sectoral interests or to project particular sectoral interests, it would appear that he is committed to furthering that long-standing project in America of deepening the India-US strategic partnership, and in particular the security dimension, the military dimension. It's not a coincidence that in the run-up to Prime Minister Modi's visit, we've seen not quite an announcement, but ample indication of big-ticket defense agreements, defense sales on the horizon, the sale of Guardian drones, for example. And there was also an agreement between Lockheed and Tata for the potential manufacture of F-16s, although I would say I'm not entirely convinced that this is technology that India needs to bring in at this stage. But I think that deeper strategic partnerships anchored in military cooperation is probably going to be a key component of what emerges from the Modi-Trump meeting.
Yeah, well, and how that military partnership is used is, again, something we'll talk about in a moment. But let me first ask you, Siddharth, when you hear Donald Trump accuse India of trying to profit financially from the Paris climate change deal, you just shrug it off and say, oh, it's not what they're really thinking in Washington.
Well, it's disturbing that he should be so ill-informed about what the Paris Agreement involved and what India's commitments were and what the US's commitments were. The fact is that India has been somewhat of a reluctant recruit to the international attempt to control or to mitigate the effects of climate change. But India has, over the last 5 or 6 years, essentially worked very hard with other countries to do its bit. And India came up with a credible plan in the run-up to Paris. And the implementation of that plan depends crucially on the cooperation of richer countries and their willingness to share technology. So it's disturbing that Trump would want to walk away and repudiate everything and also misrepresent what that agreement was. But I'm hoping that at some stage the saner interest will prevail on that particular front. I don't think climate change will necessarily overshadow the Modi visit, but I do feel it's important how Trump skirts around this issue. If he attempts to repeat the kind of rhetorical points he made when he walked away from the deal, I think that wouldn't be very healthy for the bilateral relationship.
Joël Ruet, what is the crucial issue here between India and the U.S. at this point? Is it those visas? Is it the defense contracts? Is it the climate change deal? What do you see?
I think the crucial issue between India and the US is that they talk. Here you have two countries, you have two nations who've never been aligned on the details because none of them really focuses on details too much and they change very fast. But they've always kept talking. You have two economies which are large ships. One is growing super fast, the fastest in the world, that's India, and one is changing very fast these days, that's the US. So it's important that they have constant discussions. You will see issues here and there, but they're discussing.
What does it tell you that in both those countries, citizens have elected nationalists?
They have elected nationalists because they want to have an identity in this globalization. And I think both countries have citizens which perceive that they can give a dent into globalization and that they can imprint their swing onto the type of globalization you would want to have. So I don't think it's necessarily closing down any of those two economies, but it's to be more affirmative in the discussions. And the fact that you will have a bit of hard talk between the two leaders, I think is good, because they'll speak frankly.
They'll speak frankly? You agree with that, Sadanand Dume?
I think that they may speak frankly behind closed doors. I think that this is going to be quite sort of calibrated in terms of what is said in public. They're not going to take questions from the press, for instance. I doubt very much that Trump is going to say the kinds of things he said about India and the Paris Climate Accords in public. So I think that what they're going to do is put the best face on this, and I think they're both going to emphasize areas of commonality. But I do think there is room for frank conversation in private, and as long as it does not spill over into Trumpian rhetoric in public.
By the way, Sadnan, the Prime Minister of India has been making lots of visits ahead of the G20, including here to Paris. Is he hedging his bets?
I think that there's historically, if you look at Indian foreign policy, India has always hedged its bets, and it's certainly true that under Modi over the past 3 years, India has emphasized a closer relationship with the United States, perhaps more than his predecessors. It's been very clear that the United States is number one, so to speak. But I don't think that building close relationships with other major powers, including France, Germany, and Russia, is anything new for India.
And when we had Narendra Modi meeting with François Hollande, who had, well, an exciting private life, if you will, we couldn't help but notice the stark contrast. What about Modi and Donald Trump? They're very different characters in the sense of their personal lifestyles.
That's actually a very interesting point, because many people sort of, emphasize the fact that they're sort of, right-wing, nationalist, populists or whatever. But if you look at their backgrounds, they're dramatically different. Modi comes from nothing, from a very poor family. He is a self-made man in every sense of the word, did not have privilege. In fact, is a single man. He was and has not. He was sort of formally married as a child, but that was just sort of that wasn't really a marriage. And he has, in fact, risen to power based on the fact, in part, that he doesn't have a family and that he can sort of portray himself as being dedicated to the service of the nation. Certainly not glitzy in his tastes. And you contrast that with Trump, and the contrast could not be more glaring.
When we come back, we're going to take a look at how the two will cooperate, most notably when it comes to the neighbor Pakistan, and also how Donald Trump and Narendra Modi feel about identity. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the ties that bind Donald Trump, the President of the United States, to Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India. Modi at the White House, first foreign leader invited to dinner there since Trump became president. We're talking about it with Sadran Dume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal, who joins us from Washington. From Delhi, Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire, former editor of The Hindu. From New Delhi, Gaurav Bhatia, spokesperson for the BJP party of Narendra Modi. And here in the studio with us, Joël Ruet, president of Bridge Tank, which is a think tank that takes a look at relations not just with India, but
across emerging economies.
Across emerging economies. We are speaking on the day when the Supreme Court has basically overturned this travel ban, and I suspect, Sadran Dume, that this is dominating the headlines right now where you are. Donald Trump and his views toward Muslims also taking a hit with the fact that he broke with the tradition of at least once celebrating the breaking of the fast during Ramadan, the iftar, something that had dated back to the Clinton administration. Sadran Dume, Trump accused of Islamophobia by some. Are comparisons being drawn with the fact that there are people around Narendra Modi who are also accused of that?
It's certainly the case. That's one way of putting it. If you look even at the sort of narrow issue of hosting iftars, Trump is the first, as you said, the first president since Clinton to break that tradition. But Narendra Modi also, in his 3 years in office, has not hosted an iftar. And India has about 12% of India's population is Muslim. So certainly there are parallels there. But another way of framing that, or another way of looking at that, is that in some ways both of these people represent the anxieties in their populations that traditional ruling elites, the establishment, has really not addressed some of these questions of radical Islam or extremism in a way that has made them feel comfortable. And as a result, whether it's people in India turning to Modi, or whether it's people in the United States turning to Trump, you sort of see this. You see these commonalities in various parts of the world.
Siddharth Varadarajan, you agree?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Modi's rise in popularity has to do with public apprehensions about insufficient action against Islamic terrorism or Islamists or radical extremism. I think his rise is really the result of a complex set of factors, but primarily the atrophying and weakening of the Congress party and the fact that the earlier government was completely mired in corruption and non-performance. And it's in that context that you have somebody like Mr. Modi coming forward as a person promising to rejuvenate the economy and essentially, deliver corruption-free government. There was and remains a lot of, shall we say, Muslim-related rhetoric in the politics of Mr. Modi's party.
Yeah, I was going to say on that point, Uttar Pradesh's chief minister a few days ago,
absolutely,
turning heads when he took a dig at India's most iconic tourist destination, saying, and I quote, "Foreign dignitaries visiting the country used to be gifted replicas of the Taj Mahal and other minarets, which did not reflect Indian culture." Now, Yogi Adityanath, does he own that alone, that kind of statement, or does Narendra Modi own it a little bit as well?
Mr. Modi comes from an intellectual and political tradition where these kinds of remarks and this kind of sensibility is inculcated at a very early age. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the family to which the political kind of cultural family to which Mr. Modi belongs, and he was an activist in it for many years before he moved into the active political wing of the RSS, which is the BJP, essentially takes the view that Hindus are the true inhabitants of India, and that Hindu culture is the original culture of India, and that Muslims, Christians essentially are Indian only insofar as they adapt their themselves to this reality. So they are quite used to looking at all aspects of India's composite culture, a lot of which is a product of interaction with Islamic influences or Islamic culture, as something that is alien and something that is not authentic or not genuine. So Mr. Modi may not verbalize things in that way, but you will not find him criticizing this idiotic statement of the chief minister either. And I think this is where the problem lies, that he is himself a deeply ideological man. He is a product of that worldview, but he does realize that the imperatives of practical politics, particularly at this level, require him to speak a different language. So he has tried to stay quite narrowly focused on issues of development and growth, and to essentially he coined this phrase, "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas," that we stand for the development of everybody in a way. But in reality, a lot of the rhetoric that we see, a lot of the wider politics and the wider noise that exists in the political system today, due to the activities of his own party people, runs counter to that stated objective. So I think this is a complexity that really stares us in the face. And to that extent, he's quite different from Trump. Trump is a man who's perhaps instinctively ideological, but not deeply felt. He has no, I wouldn't say, he has no deeply evolved ideology. Essentially, he's a pragmatic businessman who has found that a kind of sharp rhetoric against Muslims serves a political purpose. But that's quite different from the origins and the evolution of the thinking of the Bharatiya Janata Party to which Mr. Modi belongs.
Gaurav Bhatia, you agree that Narendra Modi is somebody more steeped in a political ideology and that Trump basically acts more by instinct?
Yeah, it would be right to say that Mr. Narendra Modi has been a grassroots worker. He's risen from the ranks below to become the Prime Minister of the country. But I disagree when it is said that Mr. Narendra Modi has not been taking along the minority, because I would like to just tell you, even today, look at Mr. Narendra Modi's tweet. He's abroad, he's visiting the US, but he did not forget to wish the Indian minority community happy Eid. So he has been very inclusive in his approach. And as one of the panelists said, his motto has been clearly support from everyone, development for everyone. And yes, I would say that in him, every Indian has a lot of expectations and he has been able to fulfill them. And yes, the ideology comes from the Constitution of India, recognizing the secularism of India. And therefore, it would be completely incorrect to say that, he is not catering to the minority community in India. Having said that, I would also like to touch upon the issue of terrorism, which I think would be at the forefront of the dialogue between Mr. Narendra Modi and Mr. Trump, because the US as well as India has been very adversely affected by the terrorist activities that we have seen, be it 9/11 or Parliament attack in India. And there, I think there is a lot of common ground where a meaningful dialogue can really help both countries identify countries which actually support terrorism, which provide their land and base for terrorists. And I think the nation I'm referring to is Pakistan. And therefore, the US and India would definitely touch upon that very crucial and important issue for both countries too.
Joël Ruet, this issue of Pakistan, it is always the issue that seems to dominate when we talk about, after all, why is India buying those drones and buying those? Some say it's to watch a little bit the activities of the Chinese as well, but it is all about Pakistan when you go to India, that there is still that obsession on defense matters, especially when we see what's going on right now in Kashmir.
I would want to get back to ideology, if you will. Ideology is one thing, facts are facts. Historical facts is that India has been the most peaceful place in the earth for the last 300 years. For the last 3 centuries, you compare to any place of the world, no wars, less civil movements, and etc. So it's been the most peaceful place. Another fact is that an economy grows on the long term whenever you have inclusive growth, and I think this will be the touchstone of Mr. Modi's government, and they're also working on that. And about the business-oriented approach, I would say that you have 2 parts in the government. You have one part of the government of Narendra Modi, which is ideological, but you have one part which is definitely business-oriented and which is transforming India. And I think it's important to state that. Now, getting back to Pakistan, I think by and large the relationship on the long term has been contained. It's pretty normal for 2 countries which are in a vicinity to check each other in terms of relationship and in terms of.
Well, they've had 4 wars, and it's heated up in the last few months.
Most of them have been limited. Most of them have been extremely limited in time, in space. And the real issue today, I think, over the last few years has become China's role in the relationship between India and Pakistan. And I think if Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi are going to talk India-Pakistan, they're going to talk about China much more than about Pakistan.
Sadnan Dume, when the France 24 debate went to Delhi back in 2013, we were expecting people to talk to us about Pakistan. They didn't seem to care that much. They were much more interested in China. Over dinner at the White House, which of the 2 will come up more in conversation?
I think they'll both come up. I think that in terms of grand strategy, in terms of the big picture, China is obviously a much bigger factor. It's a concern that both India and the United States share. But that doesn't mean that India's somewhat narrower concerns with Pakistan go away, particularly on the issue of cross-border terrorism, which has been particularly important to this government. So they're both going to be there. But certainly in terms of people who look at the big picture, China is at the heart of the US-India relationship in a way that Pakistan, frankly, is not.
In a way that, but it's also, of course, a 3-way factor. The Trump administration is about to signal, it seems, that it's going to send a lot more troops to Afghanistan. How does the United States play it?
Yeah, it certainly seems that they are going to have, that there will be more troops in Afghanistan. I think that there is a desire to at least give it another shot, not to pull out precipitately, to see if Pakistan can be pressured into being more cooperative. It'll be interesting to see what kind of cooperation is envisaged with India. There's been some breathless talk about Indian troops on the ground in Afghanistan, which I personally doubt very much is going to happen. But there's certainly a review going on in Washington of how to approach South Asia. Afghanistan is central to that, but also Pakistan. So I think that quite independent of the India question, the United States is coming to the view, and certainly this administration is, that the previous administration of Barack Obama used too many carrots and too few sticks in dealing with Pakistan, and that if they want cooperation from Pakistan, they have to calibrate this better and find a way to at least begin to punish Pakistan for its support for cross-border terrorism.
Punish them
not
how?
just against India, but also against Afghanistan.
Punish them how?
There could be various things, like more conditionalities on aid, a cut in aid, targeted sanctions, more room for India in Afghanistan, taking sort of less, paying less heed to Pakistani concerns about India's footprint in Afghanistan. There are there's sort of whole range of options that they could pursue.
Of course, the Pakistanis would point to the fact that they say there's also trouble on the Indian side. They note, for instance, that there have been clashes in Kashmir, and the Indian part of Kashmir, throughout Ramadan. 51 killed. In one of them, a police deputy superintendent was beaten to death by a crowd outside a mosque last Thursday. But the clashes have been ugly in that part, and there is that disputed area there. Siddharth Varadarajan, again, what does the Trump administration say when it comes to the long-standing rivalry between India and Pakistan?
Well, early indications suggest, and this is even before Modi and Trump have begun their meeting, that the US has handed India something of a little gift before the meeting, which is the designation of Sayyid Salahuddin, who is the leader of one of the extremist groups that are active in Kashmir, called the Hizbul Mujahideen. So Salahuddin has been designated as a terrorist under Executive Order 13224, which essentially means that the US will want to block any assets that he has. I doubt very much that this gentleman has assets in the US. So it perhaps it's symbolic. But I think as a gesture to India and as a sign to Pakistan that the Trump administration takes India's complaints about the activity of terrorist groups on the Pakistani side very, very seriously, I think this is a significant development.
And the fact that, let me ask you, Siddharth, the fact that we're speaking on the day where the Chinese foreign minister is in Pakistan. There's talk of a lot more investment on the part of the Chinese in Pakistan. Is Beijing taking sides?
Well, Beijing is clearly taking sides, and the big story over the last 2 or 3 years, I think, in geopolitical terms, is the degree to which the Pakistani side has moved decisively into the Chinese camp in a sort of evolving geopolitical rivalry between the US and Pakistan. Of course, things are not at breaking point at all, and Pakistan has good relations with the US too, and the US sees a great deal of value in what Pakistan offers to it, particularly with the war in Afghanistan. But it is clear that the Pakistani side has used its proximity with the Chinese to essentially extract leverage, and they've done it fairly successfully so far without damaging their own relationship with the US. If Trump listens to what Prime Minister Modi is likely to tell him, and the message will be that we need the US to bat alongside India in ensuring that Pakistan respects its commitments to fight against terrorism in all forms, no matter whom these terrorists direct their fire against, and that Pakistan has obligations to act against the activities of these groups on its soil, on its territory. I think that would be a positive outcome, and one that Pakistan will have to take note of. But essentially, Pakistan has gained some room for maneuver because of its closer relations with China, and of course its improved relations with Russia too.
Gaurav Bhatia, you agree that we seem to have lost the connection there with Gaurav Bhatia. We'll try to reconnect with New Delhi. Let me ask you, Joël Ruet, about this. The relationship with China, how important is it at this particular point in time? And how should India view China? How should the United States view China when it comes to this area?
Through its neighbors first, we are talking about Pakistan. I think China is really developing an edge over the US in Pakistan because China has two advantages. First of all, it's consistent over time. No elections, no swift in the policy and etc. So the consistency, this long term, is very important. And second of all, there is now a leverage. We're going way beyond the level of particular projects. With the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia, Pakistan becomes for China more than ever a very key position, a very key land in the strategy, in the global strategy of China. So I think that's going to make the margins of the US in Pakistan very thin. And that's getting anticipated by New Delhi nowadays.
All right, and before we go, we're going to have our Media Watch segment in a moment. And I want to ask you about the cover of this week's Economist, which wonders just how much India is putting toilets before temples. That was the campaign promise of Narendra Modi. The cover story this week points to a drop in bank loans in India, bank loans to the private sector. The fact that demonetization hasn't worked the way that Modi wants. The magazine even talks about the illusion of reform. Do you agree with that, Joanne?
The demonetization had two dimensions. One was clearly political. It has been said by commentators that this was the one single move since independence that would affect, be it positive or negative, every single Indian household. And it did. And there was a test after that, political test. And whether we like it or not, BJP won the test in Uttar Pradesh. So this political dimension to test the capacities of the government was extremely important. Now, on the economic impact, I would be rather mixed. I would say that you have had some impact. In a sense, some part of the money raised from corruption, black money, black economy has been tamed down a bit. Demonetization hasn't happened in such a great way. And on this, definitely, India is now lagging far behind China, where it's a massive movement. So India should be concerned with that. I agree.
All right, we need to have everybody back to talk about this issue. We're priming the pump for another discussion here. Joël Ruet, I want to thank you. I want to thank Saradan Dume for being with us from Washington, Siddharth Varadarajan and Gaurav Bhatia in New Delhi. Stay with us. As promised, Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James. Emma, as we said on the show, very different personal lifestyles between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi.
Yes.
Yet some are still, I noticed when I was reading the papers this morning, the Indian columns, still employing the word possible bromance.
Absolutely. It is definitely a theme, whether you're looking at the US coverage or the Indian coverage. In fact, the Washington Post is among those hinting that perhaps there could be a budding romance or a one-night stand with this particular meeting. The Washington Post says that the two men seem in some ways to be kindred spirits. They say that despite a lot of sweet talk, though, the question remains whether this dalliance is going to blossom. Why all the romantic analogies? Well, perhaps it's something to do with the fact that this is the first time that Donald Trump has actually entertained a world leader with dinner at the White House. Perhaps that's what's on their minds. I'm not quite sure. But there have certainly been some fairly warm communications on Twitter. Donald Trump tweeting the, important strategic issues to discuss with a true friend. And Narendra Modi, his reply, saying greatly looking forward to meeting and discussing with Donald Trump those issues and thanking him for his warm personal welcome. There are some similarities, not least the fact that the two of them are pretty big on social media. In fact, they rank 1 and 2 among world leaders. And Mark Noller pointing out here that Donald Trump and Narendra Modi are Twitter kings. 32.8 million for Donald Trump, while Narendra Modi has 31 million. Now, they've got a long way to go to catch up with certain other celebrities, including Katy Perry, who was the first person this month to actually go beyond 100 million Twitter followers. But the interesting thing with her is that only 37% of her followers are actually real accounts. So how does how do Modi and Trump measure up? Well, Narendra Modi gets 55% of his followers deemed to be real by Twitter audit. So that's 13.5 million fake accounts following him.
How do they calculate all this?
It's very complicated. I did read it. It's to do with whether people have ever tweeted, whether they've ever posted their own photograph as their avatar. They have a way of trying to prove whether these accounts are
active
genuine.
Twitter users.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump has 11.6 million of these fake accounts. They're often referred to as bots. They're sort of generated. They can even be bought as well. A lot of people will buy their own followers just to look more impressive in terms of followership. Republic, which is an Indian publication, has used the hashtag Modi Trump handshake, and it's another thing that a lot of people are focusing on right now. Really quite intrigued.
What, after the one with Macron and Trump?
The thing is that they both have rather unusual signature handshakes that have garnered a lot of attention over the years. Now, you don't necessarily think of Narendra Modi straight away, but you may recall when he met Prince William, I think it was last year, or was it 2014, but he actually shook his hand, and his hand was gripped so tightly that if we take a look at this close-up, you can see the actual finger marks that were left behind. It was a real finger-crushing, bone-crushing handshake on that occasion when Prince William was visiting India. This was another rather infamous greeting from Narendra Modi with François Hollande, one of the most awkward hugs and embraces between world leaders that you're ever likely to see, I think it's fair to say, although it did actually get slightly worse. It's as if it's possible. Here you can see what happened just after that hug.
That's not fair.
It's very, very unfortunate. But a lot of people talking about the fact that Narendra Modi does have this strange way of greeting people that is normally unseen. And the Washington Post is among those wondering whether Donald Trump might get the Barack Obama treatment. This was him meeting Narendra Modi. And interestingly, in their article, they don't make any mention of their own leaders' rather unusual sort of grab and jerk, very dominant type of handshake. There's no mention of that whatsoever. But they do talk about, in quite a lot of detail, Narendra Modi and his technique. They say that he is known for his impressively awkward physicality. The reason, well, they're suggesting that perhaps some people say he's a little too concerned about his own image, clothes and photo opportunities. Others say that it's about putting him on an equal footing with those other world leaders, saying, I'm not here to be looked down on, I'm an equal, I am your friend.
Well, something we'll watch at the White House, something we'll watch at the G20. Emma James, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.